So I'm going to talk today, I'll start with kind of a recap of what we did on Tuesday, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about economic growth. Okay, so on Tuesday, there were a couple of important topics. One, I talked about risk. That's a big marker. Make my marker size. Okay. One, I talked about risk as something that individual, like savers, lenders, dislike. Though in any form of lending out money, there is some risk involved. Okay. Things in terms of riskiness, banks tend to be just about the safest place for investors to put their money, then bonds, and then the riskiest thing are stocks. Okay, now economists believe that markets tend to be efficient, especially financial markets, where like investors with deep pockets will try to ensure that like all stocks, bonds, other assets will get the same expected return aside from risk. Okay, now there are like expected return means on average or given the information that we have right now, they'll all do the same with an adjustment for risk. Okay, and so in terms of, so reward goes the same way. The reward right. Okay. The reward ordering goes the same way. The reward from sticking your money in the bank, less than from saving through bonds, less than from saving through stocks. Now, individual savers, basically, there are three things that they can pay attention to in their portfolios. One is where they want to be on the risk versus reward continuum or spectrum. And this is a matter of preference.
Sorry, my laptop was just making noise.
Oh, your laptop. Okay. Okay, so this is a matter of preference. The second thing is when it comes to managing risk, reducing risk, diversification is always important. Okay, now I bring this up in the context of how people can save or whatever, like invest their money in stocks and bonds and so forth. But it's a statement that is generally true. Diversification lowers risk. And so, for example, one issue in the market for protective equipment over the past, how long has it been, 9 months, is that many hospitals, for example, had only a single supplier of protective equipment. So, of course, when their supplier ran out of stuff, they had no fallback. And even worse, many of the producers of the protective equipment were all in the same country, China. So when there was some big economic interruption in China, that disrupted the entire market for protective equipment in the United States. So if each hospital, instead of having just one company that supplied it with protective equipment, and that equipment was all manufactured in China, in principle, a hospital would do better if it ordered its equipment, do better at managing risk if it ordered its equipment through 3 suppliers, and each of those suppliers acquired their materials from different countries. One received materials from China, one received materials from Vietnam, one from Germany. And then an economic crisis that affects one country or one distributor is not going to be as catastrophic for the hospital in terms of like complete loss of protective equipment. Does that make sense? Okay, again, diversification, like spreading out, having, maybe you can think of it as redundancy. There's the old expression about don't put all your eggs in one basket. When it comes to national economies, a country that is very dependent on a single export is vulnerable to fluctuations in markets. So countries that rely on exporting, so for example, Ghana is a country that primarily exports cocoa beans, chocolate. And so the fortunes of the country are largely determined by like fluctuations in people's, in consumers' preferences for chocolate or demands for chocolate. Okay, so that is a complete lack of diversification. If something changes about people's preferences for that one good, it impacts the entire country very strongly. Okay, so again, while I brought up diversification in this context of financial markets and consumers' financial decisions, it's a general principle. Diversification reduces risk. The final thing that I brought up was a matter of fees. Economists believe that if markets work efficiently, nobody can pick stocks or bonds or investments that offer a better outcome than anyone else. And so you might as well just randomly select your stocks and bonds. Regardless, the best you can do when selecting a mutual fund is find one that spends the least money, especially on hiring people to try to pick stocks. So low fees are important. And that's mostly what you need to know about personal finance in order to have a successful life. Okay. The next topic that I brought up is present value. Okay. And the idea here is that $100 today is not the same as $100 in 10 years. Even though they both are called $100, they are different amounts of money. They purchase different amounts of consumption. If we want to figure out the present value of money in the future, in other words, how much current consumption could you get from some money that you would receive in the future, the present value of X dollars T years in the future with an interest rate of R% is X divided by 1 plus R over 100 to the power of T. Okay? So for example, what is the present value of $500 in 3 years when the interest rate is 10%, the way that you would calculate this is 500. Oh, that's not 500. 500 divided by 1 plus, then the interest rate 10 over 100 to the power of 3. You clear on that? So 500 divided by 1.10 to the power of 3, 500 over, I believe that's 1.331. Let me pause for a minute to consult my calculator. Okay, equals $375.65. Okay, so again, if you're promised $500 in 3 years, what that's actually worth today in terms of how much that will allow you to consume today is $375.65. Okay, so if you were to offer me a choice between receiving $375 today or $500 3 years in the future, I'd be like, it's the same to me. It buys me the same amount. Yeah.
So yeah, I remember seeing an equation very similar to this when it comes to calculating the interest rate or something. What's the exact difference? Because in the other equation you multiply by the X amount of dollars, and in this one you divide.
Okay. Dividing is for present value. The other thing that showed up was future value, which involved multiplying. And so this is, if I want to know what $500 today would purchase in the future. So it's the same thing except working the other way. Maybe I shouldn't even say $500. Let's say $300 today. What would that purchase in the future? And formally, the future value is calculated as whatever the amount of money is times 1 plus R over 100 to the power of T. So if it were the case that you want to know what is $300 worth in 5 years when the interest rate is again, for the sake of simplicity, 10%. Then we calculate the future value is the original $300 times, and then it's 1.10 to the power of 5, which is 483.15. Okay, so again, these two quantities, $300 today and the quantity $483 in 5 years, these are equivalent. If you were to ask me which of them I would prefer, I'd say it's a toss-up. They both would buy me the same consumption in 5 years. They'd also buy me the same consumption today. If I were to take the $483 and work back to how much could I purchase with that today, how much could I purchase with a promise of $483 in 5 years? The answer would be it would purchase $300 today. Again, these two quantities are equivalent. $300 today and $483 in 5 years. Okay, so having said those things, I think I was done talking about finance. Any questions? So, kind of the new subject is production and growth in an economy. Okay, countries are interested in growing their economies. And I think a simple explanation of why is that national income accounting identity that says that what a country produces, so here's the production of the economy, is equal to what it consumes plus what it invests plus government expenditures plus exports. I mean, the main thing is if production goes up, any of these other things can go up. All of them could go up simultaneously. People in the country could consume more. They could invest more, which means that the country will grow even faster. The government can spend more money and still they export more. So increasing production is a good thing because it means the potential to do all of those things on the right-hand side, which are the things that we like. So what are the factors that impact production? Let me talk about these factors impacting production. And maybe I will give 5 factors impacting production. One is physical capital. Per person. Second is human capital. Per person. Third, natural resources per person. Fourth, technology. And fifth, population. Population. Okay, physical capital refers to all the items that are used in production that don't get used up. So equipment, factories, machinery, classroom buildings, tables, projectors, iPads. All of these things are physical capital, stuff that is used in production but doesn't get used up. Okay, tools in production. So human capital then, human capital refers to things that make people more productive, mainly skills, education. These are the main things that we think of as human capital. So physical capital are like tools, physical things that make people more productive. Human capital are soft skills that make people more productive. Education, training, but also things like health and nutrition contribute to how productive people are. Natural resources, like this is the source of materials that are basically the third thing that goes into producing stuff, right? Production requires people, labor doing stuff. It requires the physical capital, the tools, and it requires some materials that get transformed into the final product. So the bakery producing bread requires the physical capital of the oven in the bakery, the time provided, the time and skill of the baker, that's human capital, and then the wheat that goes into production is like the material. The wheat begins with natural resources. It begins with fertile farmland and sunlight. I suppose those are the natural resources that create the wheat. Okay, and these first three things, physical capital, human capital, and natural resources, I write per person because having two tools and two workers is equivalent to having one worker and one tool. Or one worker plus one tool is productive, but two workers with one tool are not twice as productive. And it is about the capital to labor ratio that's most important. Number of tools per worker is the way to think of that. And then like education, human capital is the human capital per worker. Natural resources, again, per worker. But a country, like if we're comparing two countries that have the same level of natural resources, but one has twice the population, we do not expect them to be equally productive. Okay, technology, however, I'm not writing technology per person because this is something that everyone can use. And this is information. And once the technology gets developed, everyone can use it. So it's like a public good. Non-rival, as we say. Okay, the final thing I list here is population on its own. And population might have a couple of things. One is a larger population allows more specialization. It's possible, though, that a larger population causes congestion. And that there's not enough production per person. Okay, and I'll address that in a minute. So, if you are trying to think of things that will help a country grow, imagine that the country of Albania has hired you as a consultant to help them grow their economy, and they ask you for ideas. The answer is really something on this list needs to be improved. Or if you're voting on some economic policies and you want the United States economy to grow, think about voting for policies that improve any of these things. Does that make sense? That's why it's important to understand these are the factors that impact production so that you can make smart decisions about growing the economy of a country or the things that go into the economy of a country and what policies are good for countries. So I'm going to kind of think about these one at a time and talk about them one at a time. If a country wants to increase physical capital, this means that the country is building more factories, building more tractors and bulldozers, more airports and highways. Okay? Those things will make the country more productive, but in order to get those things, we need savings. Right? It's the money that individual people save or really loan out to others that create capital, that become the investment in capital. So savings, either domestic savings, by domestic savings, I mean the people of the country save more money, or foreign investment. So policies that promote domestic savings will tend to increase economic growth. Okay, now, something to keep in mind, however, is that there's a trade-off between savings and other uses of money. Okay. Remember, the national income accounting identity. Everything a country produces goes towards consumption, investment, growth, or exports. If investment in a country goes up, it means that something else has to go down. So if the people are saving more, investing more, comes at the expense of consumption, or it means the government has to cut down on expenditures, or exports come down. But the savings has to come from somewhere. What in the world? Go away. Okay. The savings has to come out of something. One concern, another way to think about this, is that increasing one of these things, other than investment, will drive down investment. So, for example, if government expenditures go way up and nothing else changes, then investment has to go down. The government expenditure, as we sometimes say, it crowds out investment. Okay, the government is using up resources that could have gone toward investing in new machinery, new highways, new infrastructure that makes the economy more productive in the future. Okay, so I bring this up so that we can think about kind of both parts of savings. One is that it has to come out of something. And so it might mean that people consume less. Also, to be aware that policies promoting the other things cause the savings to go down. Okay, but policies that promote domestic savings. One thing that has happened in the U.S. is that there's been an increasing reliance on people saving for retirement. Okay. A lot of the retirement saving that people do, every month their employer takes money out of their paycheck and puts it into a long-term savings account called usually a 401k account. Okay, or sometimes you'll hear people refer to IRA accounts, individual retirement accounts. both of those are saving for retirement, which is different from the way that Social Security retirement works or an old-fashioned pension works. Social Security, there is no savings involved. The government collects tax money from current workers to pay for the pensions of the retirees. And again, there's no savings involved. So an argument for having more like private savings for retirement and relying less on Social Security is that in the period between when the worker works and retirement, that money which is put aside for savings is in fact being borrowed by companies to help those companies grow. And so it's a form of investing in the economy. Okay, does it make sense how like that policy of saving for retirement like promotes growth in a country? Okay, and there are other policies. So saving for retirement, another policy, special savings benefits for college. Okay, there are sort of subsidized college savings accounts called 529 plans. I believe that's right. That again are a form of kind of government subsidized savings. Well, the good thing about any policy that promotes savings is while that money is being saved, it's being used by companies for investment. So getting parents to save up money for college is better for the economy overall than having parents pay for college when the students are in college. Instead of paying for it all during the years when you're in college, if parents save up in advance, then while the money is in that savings account, it's being used as investment in the economy. So again, policies that promote savings will increase physical capital. Second thing, the country wants to grow its capital. It can look for foreign investment. Now, usually when we talk about foreign investment, we think of people from more developed countries investing in least developed countries. But the important things for foreign investment are the same as for investment everywhere. In order to attract investors, investors care about two things: the return and the risk. Now, the good thing about foreign investment for less developed countries is that the potential is high in less developed countries. Weeks ago, I talked about production and brought up the idea of diminishing marginal product, that each additional unit of input produces less than the units before it. And that is true with capital investment as well. The first $1 million of investment brings the biggest growth in production. And the next million brings an increase in production, but not quite as much. And the third million, an increase in production, but again, not quite as much as the first, second, or third. For countries with the least physical capital in the first place, additional physical capital goes further. It's expected to be more profitable. But the other side of this is that there are higher risks. And so if countries want to attract foreign investment, they need to do what they can to minimize risk. Some of the risks include political instability. Let me make this more positive. Allowing for political stability. If you have some money and you want to loan it to a company to help that company grow, you don't want to loan it to a company in a country that's experiencing a civil war. You want to loan it to a company in a place that is fairly stable. Okay? Political stability. Well-defined property rights. And protection for property rights. And so, as a counterexample, I'll bring up that Venezuela in the 1990s nationalized its petroleum supplies. In other words, the petroleum, the oil that was underground, the Venezuelan government said, that's ours now. We're going to take it away from whoever it used to belong to, and now it belongs to the government. Okay? That's kind of a violation of property rights. And that's the kind of thing that keeps investors away. If they're concerned that the government might not respect property rights, they are unlikely to invest in that country. And it's not the first time that's happened. In the 1920s, Mexico did exactly the same thing with its oil supplies. It nationalized them. Until the 1920s, American businesses were investing heavily in oil production in Mexico. I think I understand that the Mexican government's greed that, here we have all these gringos coming in, stealing our oil, making money off our oil. We're going to keep that for the government. Well, that maybe works as a one-time deal in the short run, but it damages the country's reputation. And in the long run, creates risk that foreign investors don't like. Another thing is currency risk. So currency risk, there are a couple of things. Exchange rates. And inflation. So there's always a risk with exchange rates that if I promise I'm going to sell you a box of widgets next month for 100 pesos, that 100 pesos could be different from what I'm expecting it will be right now. If we were dealing in the same currency, if we're dealing in the same currency, we don't have to anticipate exchange rate changes. But most likely, if we're exchanging in different currencies, I use dollars, you use pesos, those values will change over the next month, and I might be getting more or less than what I currently anticipate. So that's the issue of exchange rate fluctuations. Also inflation. Now, countries that have rapid inflation, the money is losing value, and I don't want to do business if I'm getting paid in currency that loses value. So there are a couple of strategies that countries can use to deal with exchange rate risk. One thing that has been successful for Europe is switching to a common currency. Yeah. Imagine the difficulty that a German business used to have when it was dealing with workers in, for example, Spain, and the German company was developing some product, and it knew what it would sell those product, knew the price it would sell that product in Germany in German marks, but it was paying its workers in Spain in Spanish pesetas, and some months the labor bill would come in higher than expected, some months it would come in lower than expected. It would fluctuate, and that creates instability for the business. Now, there might be many reasons why the German company wants to do manufacturing in Spain. There might be advantages to manufacturing in Spain, but if the two countries are using different currencies, it creates another source of risk. Okay, and around 2000, so 20 years ago, most European countries switched to using a common currency, the euro. Other countries will do business in the most popular currency worldwide for doing international business. Does anyone want to guess what that is? Most popular currency for doing international business. The American dollar. Okay. And there are several countries that have their currency pegged. So pegging, pegged to the American dollar. In other words, they have a fixed exchange rate with the American dollar. This is something that, for example, Argentina at one point decided that to stabilize its currency, it was going to peg the Argentine peso, I believe, at 1-to-1 with the American dollar. A fixed exchange rate, and the government would guarantee that. And so that makes it easier for investors doing business for companies in the US to do business in Argentina. We know exactly what the costs will be. It also helps investors from around the world if they believe that the American dollar is a more stable currency than the Argentine peso. Okay, so again, this is a strategy that some countries have used. Now, inflation. This is another problem. Money is a very, very funny thing. And I did not bring my wallet with me today. But, okay, imagine that I brought out a green piece of paper and it had a picture of Benjamin Franklin on it. Would you want that? If I were to give it to you, would you want it? Okay, why? Because you like that pretty picture of Benjamin Franklin? You like the color green? Or what? Because of what it can buy. Okay, in other words, you believe you can buy stuff with that. And the reason you can buy stuff with that is because some merchant will accept it as currency, and they accept it as currency only because they believe they can buy something with it from the next person. And that next person will accept it as currency only because they believe they can buy something from it from the person after them. So the reason that green piece of paper has value to you is because you believe someone else believes that someone else believes that someone else believes that it will be accepted as currency. So it depends on a mutual system of belief, which like, money really scares me. This is all I remember from my graduate school training in monetary economics, is that money is a really frightening thing because it really is just based, like, it works because of this mutual system of beliefs. But once that starts unraveling, the currency loses value quickly. Like, imagine that I'm a merchant and I'm not so certain that people will accept $1 from me. Like, I'm not sure if the next guy is going to accept $1 from me, so I'm going to say, you know what? Don't pay me in dollars. I insist on being paid in euros or gold. Well, you then don't want to acquire dollars if you're going to buy things from me, because you know I don't like dollars. You're going to ask to be paid in euros or gold or whatever it is that I want to be paid in. And so then the people who are like giving money to you, they are going to want to get paid in gold or euros or whatever currency you are going to accept. But the problem is, once people stop having faith in a currency and they're uncertain whether other people will accept the currency from them, they will want to switch to a different currency that they believe will be accepted. And that means that very quickly the value of the dubious currency can just vanish. Okay, and that's a crisis called hyperinflation. Okay, hyperinflation is when money loses its value very rapidly. And there have been a few notable examples in history. The most recent one is in Venezuela, where the currency has become worthless. And every day the government is printing new bucket loads of money to try to buy the things the government wants to purchase, but the money is so worthless it has to print huge quantities to get anyone to accept it, which means every day they are printing bigger and bigger quantities, and the money just loses value very rapidly, and no one wants to hold it or accept it because it loses value so rapidly. And so effectively, there is no currency being used in Venezuela currently, which means the economy just doesn't function. So again, this has been a huge crisis. In the past, there have been periods of hyperinflation in Argentina, in periods of hyperinflation in Zimbabwe. There's a period of hyperinflation in Germany in the 1930s. At home, I have a German 10 billion mark bill, okay? 10 billion marks from the 1930s. And the government was, and this was worth almost nothing. And again, there's this runaway inflation in the country. Everyone was insecure that their German marks would purchase something the following day. And so if they did accept payment in German marks, they would ask to get paid a huge amount. So this would cause prices to go up. And those prices going up, that's inflation. And the prices are inflating today in anticipation that they will inflate even more tomorrow and even more the day after that. Again, this is runaway inflation, or hyperinflation is runaway inflation, and it has essentially caused the economies of these countries to stop. Hungary had a period of hyperinflation. Okay, economies just don't work well at all when there's concern about the stability of currency. By the way, Argentina's solution to its period of inflation was pegging the value of its currency to the US dollar. And that's kind of the government's commitment that it's not just going to print money to solve problems in the future, and that money does have a stable value to it. Okay, so I've gone through a couple of these things. Let's see. Physical capital, where was I? Okay, human capital. Moving on. If we want our country to grow, we need to invest in human capital. We need to do things that make our workers more productive. And so, as I've said, normally economists think of human capital as education, training, and skills. Improving those things will grow the production of the economy. If we want to implement one policy that I think would do more than anything else to increase production in the United States, improve the economy of the United States, it would probably be providing free community college education to anyone who wants it, vocational skills to anyone who want them, as a matter of growing human capital. Okay, but also under human capital, public health and nutrition. If a country has health problems, has nutrition problems, workers are not going to be productive. Also, human rights. Okay. Human rights protections can be important for economic growth. Think of just one example. Gender. Imagine a country has a policy that prevents women from entering into certain professions or from acquiring education. Purely on economic grounds, that policy is a bad idea because it keeps workers from being productive, right? It keeps female workers from being productive. So anything that hinders the ability of these women to be productive workers is bad for the economy as a whole. Okay. Now, there are other reasons why we might care about gender rights, but purely on economic grounds, it's beneficial to ensure that all workers have equal access to employment, have equal access to education, that workers' rights are being respected, that they are able to work in safe jobs. Okay, all of these things are important to human capital and toward ensuring that workers are productive. Now, next on my list were natural resources. Okay. A lot of production involves converting resources into final goods. And so countries that have resources are going to be more productive than countries that don't. And these resources can include things like timber, minerals, fertile land, petroleum, sun, water, okay, fish, and so on. Now, there are some things to think about, especially with common resources. There needs to be good management of common resources. Okay, so things like the fish in the ocean need to be managed, or timber on public lands needs to be managed, minerals. Okay, all of these things should, like, in order for the country to be productive, there needs to be proper management of things that are essentially common resources. One solution to the problem, by the way, you remember common resources that anyone could use, like fish in the ocean. The typical problem is that if it is something that is non-excludable, anyone can use it, but it is rival in consumption, it gets depleted, then there is overuse of the common resource. One solution to the problem is privatization. And so you assign, or the government allows someone to be in charge of managing timber. Instead of making it public timber that anyone can harvest, privatize it. Okay. The second thing along these lines is like sustainability. Okay, sustainability. Whether the, and I put a question mark here, whether the resource is being replaced as quickly as it's being consumed. Okay. That's maybe a definition of sustainability. Now, we hear a lot about sustainability, and we think of it as a good thing because we don't want for the world to run out of some important resource. We want to ensure that it will always be around. But maybe sustainability is overrated. Okay? Because sometimes resources are converted into other resources. "400 years ago, North Carolina was covered in beautiful pine forests, and the pine trees would grow for 200 to 400 years. Beautiful old trees. And then Europeans arrived, they chopped down all these trees to make ships and buildings and convert the land into farmland. I'm not sure that's been a bad trade-off. I mean, so cutting down the trees to build ships, by the way, historically, during colonial times, that was one of the big contributions of North Carolina to the global economy, building ships. And we'd cut down these pine trees. The old pine trees would have wood that was very resistant to rot on the inside. Plus, ships needed to be covered in tar, and tar was manufactured from the sap of pine trees. That would make the ships waterproof. So, like, these North Carolinians got a nickname from producing so much tar. What is the nickname that North Carolina picked up from that? We are the blank blank state. Tar Heel state. Okay. So North Carolina chopped down all these trees, used them to produce ships and houses. What are ships and houses in my simple economic world, like how do I think of ships? What is their role in the economy? Do they increase production of companies? Kind of. Oh, yes.
Well, you're not thinking about public versus private goods or anything like that.
Not thinking of public versus private. I think of ships as a form of capital, physical capital. They made companies more productive at being able to move materials and goods around the globe. So North Carolina was converting like these resources into capital that made the economy more productive. Cutting down trees to build buildings. Some of those buildings were used for producing stuff. Some were used for houses. That also contributes to capital and to human capital if we shelter people better. The final thing is clearing the land allowed for agriculture, allowed for grazing livestock and planting crops. So cutting down those big forests and depleting that natural resource maybe wasn't terrible. So I'm not saying that, so I'm not rejecting sustainability outright and saying it's a bad thing, but I do want to open up your minds to the idea that maybe it is not a goal on its own. Now, another thing is the fear of running out of resources. I want to talk a little bit about this. Okay. Okay. Overuse of resources. And concern about running out of resources in the world. Most economists believe we should not be very worried about these things. Okay, what about oil? What are we going to do when the world runs out of oil? Because it's going to happen at some point, right? There's a finite amount of oil underground, and we keep sucking oil out. At some point, we are going to run out of oil, and the world economy will collapse. And the economist says, no, that's never going to happen. And we're going to refer back to someone named Thomas Malthus. Okay. Thomas Malthus was an economist who wrote in the late 1700s. Okay, and what he wrote about, or what he predicted, was that there would be widespread famine and starvation. So Malthus lived in England. So he was writing specifically about England, widespread famine and starvation in England within a couple of generations, within 2 or 3 generations. So by the mid-1800s. Okay, and his logic was very simple. Land is fixed. Therefore, food production is fixed. Population grows. Therefore, eventually, population will be greater than the food that's needed to sustain it. The end. Okay? I mean, it's a very simple and logical argument that, again, if the amount of food that a country produces is fixed, the amount of food a country can produce is fixed, and the population grows, eventually the population will be too large for the food that the country can produce. And, Malthus was writing in like the 1890s, and he said that England was 2 or 3 generations away from that. So like by 1850, the country would no longer be able to feed itself. That never happened. And of course, the population of England has continued to grow even past the 1850s, while the amount of land for crops has not grown. And yet England hasn't starved. What did Malthus miss? Why was Malthus wrong?
He didn't factor in technology.
Didn't factor in technology.
Well, yeah, he didn't factor in efficiency or the Green Revolution.
It didn't factor. What was the last?
Efficiency, in the market.
And
The
you
Green
said
Revolution.
the Green Revolution. Yeah. And okay, so he overlooked. Jack, what was the word you used?
Technology.
Technology. And Blake said the Green Revolution. Do you want to define that term any
Yeah.
further?
Off the top of my head, I know it's like the extreme evolution of agricultural technology and how we grow things. So just increased efficiency in growing crops.
Okay, evolution of agricultural technology, how we grow crops. Absolutely. The mid-1800s was a time of a lot of radical improvement in producing crops. So from things like machinery, starting with the steel plow, going through things like the cotton gin, even though that wasn't for food, but the combine harvester. All of these technologies were developed in the mid-1800s and made farmers considerably more productive. The first artificial fertilizers were developed, okay? And more understanding of the role of fertilizers in growing crops, as well as things like breeding seeds selectively to improve strains of crops. So back in the olden days, let's say through the end of the 1700s, farmers would just store from each year's crop, would store a portion of the seeds to be planted the next year. Okay. Then some companies like the Burpee Company, are you familiar with the name Burpee? You see it sometimes still, the Burpee Seed Company. Okay, still a very influential company, or a very important company, came up with the idea of, hey, farmers, you don't need to store your seed. We are going to breed strains of corn or beans or whatever else that are going to be very productive and will grow well, instead of just whatever random seeds you got from leftover from last year's crop. We will work on developing new strains of crops that will be more profitable. So, like, again, these are all examples of improvement in technology. And that's exactly what Malthus overlooked, okay? That technology would improve. And today, people are better fed in England and in most parts of the world than they were at Malthus's time. Instead of like shortages of food, most people can get more food than their bodies need. There's a surplus of food. Okay, and this is a general cycle, maybe. What happens is when there's a shortage or an anticipated shortage in some resource, there is an opportunity to profit from innovation. Like, if there's a shortage in food, that's going to drive up the price of producing food. So anyone who can come up with a technology to increase food production is going to get an especially large bonus. So the shortage drives up the price. Actually, I should say that first. Let me back up a little bit in my kind of logic right here. Okay. Increase in the shortage causes the price to increase. And then that means that the profit from innovation increases. And then that leads to higher production. And then the shortage is gone. Okay. It's kind of a neat process that seems to have always played out in history. Every time that a society is headed toward a shortage of some material, innovation relieves that shortage, either by becoming more productive at producing that good, like food, or by finding alternatives. Now, if it were the case that petroleum in the world is starting to get scarce, that means that the cost of gasoline in cars would start rising, and there would be more opportunities to profit from producing cheaper alternative fuels for vehicles. It'd be more profitable to produce electric vehicles. People would be more likely to purchase your electric vehicle when the price of gas goes up. So the price of gas going up creates profits from innovating to come up with alternatives. And once that happens, there are nice electric cars, and people are no longer interested in purchasing the gasoline. So it brings down the price of gasoline, and the shortage disappears. So innovation either increases productivity or it creates alternatives, but it seems that people have always been able to hold off shortages through improving technology. And this economic process seems to do that. Another example that I brought up was oil or petroleum. Back in the 1950s, there was a petroleum engineer named King Hubbard. King was his first name, not his title, who predicted or came up with the idea of peak oil. Okay. And this was the idea that eventually the world would run out of oil. Again, amount of oil in the ground is finite. It's hard to argue with that. Amount of oil in the ground is finite. Demand for oil keeps going up. Oil gets used up. Eventually, we will use up all the oil in the world. And at that point, there will be a shortage. Okay. And he predicted that this would happen in the 1970s. That oil production would reach its peak, and then because we had, and then because supplies were drying up or being used up, oil production would decline. Okay. Peak oil did not happen in the 1970s. Hubbard revised his prediction a few times. I believe when he died, which was in the 70s, he was pretty convinced that peak oil would happen in the 1990s. Peak oil has still not happened. As a matter of fact, oil reserves, that is, the amount of oil in the ground that could be extracted, have increased. Okay, have increased steadily, and the oil reserves are greater today than they were at Hubbard's time. Why have they increased? Couple of things. One is exploration, and the other is technology. So while the amount of oil in the ground is fixed and finite, there is an increase in the amount of oil that we know about and the amount of oil that we can access. And so some types of petroleum might be locked up inside layers of rock or sand underground. And previously, it might have been thought that these could not be separated. And so there are things called oil sands. And I have to admit, I am not a petroleum engineer. I am not a geologist, so I don't completely understand what oil sands are. But my understanding is that they are layers underground of sand that is mixed with a large quantity of oil. And in the old thinking, there is no way to separate those things out. Technology has improved to the point where the oil can now be extracted from the sand, separated from the sand, and used. So the amount of usable oil has increased. Another example of technology increasing the amount of usable fossil fuels is hydraulic fracturing. Fracking has allowed a lot of natural gas that was previously thought to be unattainable to be extracted, and extracted very cheaply. Okay? Now, I'm not going to get into the environmental aspects of hydraulic fracturing, but just to point out, this is a good example of how technology has kept people from running out of natural gas. Quite the opposite. Natural gas today is more plentiful and cheaper than ever in the past. Okay? And there is kind of a silver lining to that, which is that it is putting coal out of business. And coal is a dirty fossil fuel. I mean, if we're getting into environmental impact, coal is a dirty fossil fuel Natural gas is much cleaner. So the fact that natural gas is cleaner, more plentiful, and cheaper to extract than ever before means that coal is becoming obsolete anyhow. Okay, but again, technology keeps us ahead of running out of resources. So I'm cautiously optimistic that people are never going to run out of resources, that we will always go through this like procedure where when we're faced with a shortage, it starts to drive prices up. People get creative about innovating, and then innovation leads to higher production. The shortage is gone. Okay, maybe you can breathe a little sigh of relief about the world will like run out of all the natural resources that are important, because again, so far we've done pretty well. Okay, I'm going to move on from this, even though I really like this topic and would like to talk more about it. Okay, other things that can contribute to growth in a country. Oh, let's see. So I talked about natural resources and talked about natural resources. What was the last one? Oh, population. Okay. The population of a country contributes to its production in two ways. One is that as the population grows, then there is dilution of the stocks, mainly physical capital and resources. Remember how I said that the factors that go into production include physical capital per person, natural resources per person. If the population grows more quickly than capital or resources, then the capital per person goes down, and the resources per person go down. So if a country's population grows too fast, one concern is that the resources, or these stocks of physical capital and materials, get divided among more people. But the other thing is a larger population allows for more specialization. And specialization is generally a good thing that allows countries, allows an economy to produce more. Instead of having each person try to do several jobs, we have multiple people who can each specialize in one aspect, or like one of those jobs. And generally, productivity increases. Okay, the last thing on the list was technology. Is one of the factors that contributes to a country's productivity. And so strategies for increasing the country's product can be strategies that increase technology. So if the government can support research and development, that's generally beneficial for the economy. And maybe it's important to remember that technology is a public good. Once one person develops the technology, others can use it. Now, when private people develop technology, come up with new ideas, come up with new inventions, often they can patent those ideas and profit off of them. So it does create some incentive for individual companies to invest in research. However, it would be generally more efficient if more or less all the companies put their resources together, or everyone put their resources together and invested in technologies that everyone can use. Perhaps the government has a role in doing that. Rather than relying on private companies to do development of new technologies, innovations that one private company can profit from through a patent, the government could support research and development that profits everyone. I'll mention as a good example of this, the land grant universities in the United States. Many states have a university devoted to agriculture, and a public university devoted to agriculture and engineering. So like here in Carolina, it's North Carolina State University, specializes in improvements in agriculture and improvements in engineering as public goods, and trying to educate farmers about how to be more productive, again, as a matter of a public good, trying to spread that information. This is the type of research and development that the government could promote that makes the entire economy more productive, rather than relying on private companies to come up with their own trade secrets or own proprietary or protected goods and information. Okay, so I'm kind of rushing through this because I am just about out of time, right? Okay, I'm going to stop this.